Hello friends, Andy C. Lewter here, and I want to welcome you to this mini webinar that reflects my recent lecture on Project 1619. Now, I prepared this for our students at the New Life School of Theology, located in Amityville, New York. And while I actually walked them through this presentation in person, I promised that I would do a video recording that gives a little more detailed focus and expands to some degree on that which I talked about in the physical classroom. So this is the fulfillment of that commitment and that promise. And those of you who are in class and who watched this, I'm sure you're going to recognize most, if not much, of the material that I'll be sharing. If you were not in the physical class and you're watching this under different circumstances, I do hope that it will be an enlightening experience for you. So I want to take you to my virtual classroom so that you can enjoy that which I have prepared for you. Well, again, friends, I am Andy C. Lewter, and I want to take you through this mini webinar on Project 1619. Now, I am primarily doing this for the benefit of the students who are a part of my New Life School of Theology. This actually was my September 2019 lecture that I did in class, and I want to give those students the benefit of this presentation in a bit more concise and focused kind of way. And so it is with that in mind that I am doing this particular webinar on the year 1619. So let me begin here, and I don't want to assume that everyone listening to this presentation is fully aware of who I am. So let me take just a moment to reintroduce myself. I am a native of New York. I was born in Brooklyn in 1954, grew up on Long Island. I'm a product of the Long Island Lutheran High School, where I graduated from in 1972. From there, I went on to Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, to secure a Bachelor of Arts degree with a triple major in Black History, Religion, and Communications. After Oberlin, I then went to Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to secure a Master of Divinity degree to prepare myself for what I believe was my lifelong calling. Several years later, I would go to the United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, to earn a Doctorate of Ministry degree. That was after several years of being in ministry itself. Over the last several years, I've been able to produce over 60 online courses. I'm currently the president of the New Life School of Theology, which is an online Bible college recognized and approved by the Department of Education in the state of Florida. I pastor two congregations, one in Amityville, New York, the second in Queens Village of New York City. I'm the father of two and the grandfather of six. Well, that's enough about me. Let's move on and talk about 1619. Now, the purpose of this lecture and presentation is to first acknowledge the significance of the year 1619, which is exactly 400 years from where we are today. Furthermore, this lecture will seek to explain to the student the curious relationship between Christianity and the Atlantic slave trade. Now, with that being said, I want to talk about the arrival of slaves to this country. In the year 1619, European countries began the practice of transporting captured people of Africa into the New World that would eventually become America. The reason for the slave trade was to accommodate the growing need for cheap or free labor in the New World. Now, when you hear me use the term New World, I'm contrasting that with Old World. The Old World would have been Europe, and of course the New World was the Americas and the places that had been explored and sought out by people like Columbus, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, and several other explorers of that period. Now, with that being said, after Columbus settled in America, it did not take long for merchants to see the benefit of trading for goods from the New World in exchange for money that could be used to purchase slaves from Africa that then could be sold in the New World in order to do what? To grow more crops or raw material that then could be sold to the manufacturing industry in Europe. Now, if you look at the background of the map that's on the screen, you can see where raw material was shipped from the Americas into Europe, manufactured into goods, then taken down to Africa, the western coast of Africa, where slaves would be secured. Those slaves and goods would then be returned to the New World or the Americas, where they would be sold, both goods and slaves, so that there could be increased production of raw material that would then return back to Europe. And that became the triangle or the circle, the economic triangle that was used, that we call the Atlantic Triangle. Now, a part of that Atlantic Triangle and a key crop is cotton. Prior to the New World, the primary material for clothing was leather and wool. Both of these items, however, came from animals that had to be slaughtered, which inherently kept the supply of material limited or restricted. To get wool, you had to shave sheep. Once sheep were shaven, they could no longer survive, so they had to be slaughtered and their flesh used for meat. Same thing with cattle. Once cows were skinned for their leather, the cow then had to be slaughtered, which meant that every time you produced goods that were made of wool or made of leather, that decreased your livestock population. So the amount of goods had an impact upon the amount of livestock that you had. Now, there were products like silk and cotton that had come from the Far East, but it was very, very difficult to access. And so cotton was an agricultural crop that theoretically had no limit as long as there was sufficient labor to harvest it. So what I'm saying here is that unlike animals that was restricted in terms of how much raw material they could provide, as long as you had seed and labor, you could produce an unlimited amount of cotton. Cotton was then used as a cloth material that could be used to make goods to replace any number of items that had previously been made with leather or wool. So here's the question: how does religion figure into this? Now, the rise of the first industrial revolution takes place in the mid-18th century and was an expansion of the manual industry of hand-woven cotton produced primarily in the Far East. Now, all of this would happen on the heels of the Crusades, which left the Islamic Empire in charge of the ancient trade routes into the Middle East. Let me go back here. Pope Urban II in 1049 announces rallies European soldiers and marches them into the Middle East under the banner of taking back the Holy Land from the Islamic Empire. There are 5, some scholars say 7, but at least 5 campaigns that made up the Crusades. It lasted a few hundred years, and it resulted with the European Christians being defeated by the Islamic Empire. Now, that defeat resulted in European merchants having to find an alternative way to get to India. Why? Because the way they had used for so many years was now suddenly cut off from them because of their loss to the Islamic Empire. Let me see if I can make this a little more clear. If you take a look at the map here on the screen, you will see that one of the results of the Crusades was the disallowance of Muslims to allow Christians into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, at the close of the Crusades, the Islamic Empire had control of what is now Spain, which meant that they had control of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, that's the furthest most point on the map here on Spain, which meant that Europeans were accustomed to sailing down the western coast of Europe and then going through this Iberian Peninsula to enter into the Mediterranean Sea. They could no longer do that because the Iberian Peninsula and Spain was now in the hands of the Islamic Empire, which no longer allowed them to do so. Now, as a result of that, the result being that Europeans could no longer secure their slaves from their historic markets, such as the countries of what is called Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. Now, if you look just east of the Italian boot, that area is where historically Western Europe took their slaves from. So Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia is actually a mispronunciation of terms of the Slavic countries or the Slavic countries. And that's where European slaves had come from for many, many years. But there was no longer access to those slaves because it had now been cut off. Consequently, Europeans were now forced to find new markets to secure slaves from. The answer was the west coast of Africa, where local chieftains were willing to wage war on each other in order to sell the conquered people of their wars to slave traders on the west coast of Africa. Now, friends, eventually slave traders from Europe bypassed local tribal chiefs and took slaves from the interior of the coast. If you take a look at the map here, you can see where Slavic people had been used for slaves before. They are now replaced by indigenous people on the west coast of Africa. If you look at the top of the screen, you see this Iberian Peninsula that was cut off from the slave traders, which forced them to travel further south than they had originally intended. And that's what put them in touch with this west coast African market, where they now took their slaves from. Now, friends, in order to justify their barbaric usage of slavery, Western Christianity developed a theology that suggested that European Christians were the new chosen people, and as such, were entitled to take humans from Africa and use them as they saw fit, just as the children of Israel had done in the Old Testament. So when the children of Israel went into Canaan land, there were groups there, hostile tribal groups like the Ammonites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Hittites, and the children of Israel took the land and decimated the people because they were the chosen people. In like fashion, Western Christianity argued that they were the new chosen people, that God had abandoned Israel and had made Christians the new chosen people. Therefore, they had the privilege and the benefit of doing in their day what the children of Israel, who were the former chosen people, had done in the past. And one of the proof texts that they use for this is Colossians 3 and 12, verses 12 through 17. And this in the book of Colossians actually says, therefore, as God's chosen people, and this is the biblical intent of Western Christians to argue that they were now the replacement of the children of Israel from the Old Testament. Now, with that in mind, in addition, European theology suggested that Africans were subhuman. It is very difficult to exploit a people if you see that those people are your equal. And so to justify their mistreatment of Africans, they relabeled them not as the equals to Europeans, but as being bestial or subhuman. Therefore, that justified what their treatment of these Africans were, the way they boarded them into boats, the way they starved them, the way they threw them overboard during their journey. All of this was justified because of how they chose to define who these African slaves were. Well, now that takes us to our next item, and that is merchants and missionaries. There are two companies that I want you to be familiar with. One is the Dutch East Indies Company, and the other is the East Indies Company. Now, both of these are merchant groups that sought to exploit the slave labor for the purpose of mercantilism. But it also produced a curious coming together of merchants and missionaries. Interestingly enough, 1619 would see missionaries and merchants coming together in an awkward kind of way. Missionaries taught that Christianity was needed to evangelize or civilize indigenous people or natives. The other word that they used for civilize was Christianize, while merchants saw natives as goods to be used in the expansion of mercantilism. And so it is this tandem cooperation between merchants and missionaries that gives rise to the Atlantic slave trade. Now, there'd always been a debate on whether Christians should practice slavery or not. Both sides of the argument use the Bible as their proof text. There is the story of Onesimus in the book of Philemon. A severe misinterpretation of that story led Western Christians to the conclusion that they were justified in making and using slaves. However, when you look at that story, you discover that Paul writes to Philemon, says to Philemon that Onesimus was a former slave whom he is sending back to Philemon, but he's sending him back as a Christian. And since he is a Christian, Paul is advising Philemon to no longer treat him as a slave, but to now treat him as a brother, because his Christianity makes him the equal to Philemon. Now, friends, while we know that 1619 is the year when slaves began to arrive on American shores, we tend to forget that the adoption of the transatlantic slave trade came on the heels of 1612. It was that year, 1612, when King James I of England commissioned his authorized King James Version of the Bible, which, among other things, purposely omitted the 14 books between the Old and the New Testament known as the Apocrypha. Now, why would the Apocrypha be omitted? Because embedded in those 14 books is the story of a Jewish people who were enslaved by Syrians. Antiochus IV was the leader of the Syrians, and these Jews, led by the Maccabees, actually staged a revolt. The most prominent story in the Apocrypha is the story of the Jews who refused to have their religion outlawed by Antiochus IV. Led by the Maccabean family, the Jews rose up in rebellion and physically drove the Syrians out of the Holy Land. In doing so, they rededicated their temple and created an annual celebration still practiced today, known as Hanukkah. So every year, while we as Christians celebrate Christmas, there is a parallel Jewish event called Hanukkah that is celebrated by the Jews. That Hanukkah is an annual remembrance of their freedom fight, their revolt, their revolution against Antiochus IV and his kingdom, his Greek kingdom, where they threw off the shackles of oppression and became a free people. They rededicated their temple, and this led to a period of autonomy, sovereignty, and independence on the part of Israel. That story of the Maccabees is prominent in these 14 books that we call the Apocrypha. And so King James decided that his version of the Bible ought not include this story, lest it inspire people whom he was making slaves to rise up against him and to revolt, just as the Maccabees had done many years earlier. Well, friends, that takes up just about all of my time, and I certainly want to thank you for yours. You have been listening and watching this presentation on the story of the Maccabees. I want to remind you that I do have some contact information that I'm making available here on the screen, along with a special link with a special discount to some other material that you may be interested in. I want to take you back to my office where I can conclude this conversation and this engagement of yourself by myself. Thank you for taking the time to view this presentation with me. Well, again, friends, that takes up just about all of my time, and I certainly want to thank you for yours. This has been my theological discussion on the year 1619, 400 years from the commencement of the Atlantic slave trade here in this country. I hope that you've enjoyed this material as much as I have enjoyed sharing it with you. I do hope that you will contact me and give me an opportunity to answer those questions as well. Now, if you're in my New Life School of Theology, this lecture is accompanied by 10 additional questions. If you don't have those questions, do contact our dean, Elder Deidria Seeley, or your teaching assistant on whatever grade level you're on, and they'll be more than happy to share the study questions with you, which are due the next time we meet. Until next time, this is Dr. Andy C. Lewter thanking you for your time. Looking forward to seeing you next time.